So there is no self. There is no self, and this is it. And that's about it. I mean, everything else flows from, well, everything else just flows from the first of those statements. There is no self. No one came here today. There's no one sitting here. There's no one listening to a talk about non-duality. There is no self. So what is there if there's no self? Well, what there is simply whatever's happening. Simply whatever is arising. Included in that may be the sense what is arising is a self. So there may seem to be a self, there may seem to be a person sitting there. If that is the case, that's just something that's arising. The sound of the voice arises, the feeling of the temperature in a room arises, noticing the movement of a hand arises, noticing the colour of a shirt, the pressure of a bum on the seat, maybe the feeling that all of those other experiences are being experienced by something called a person, or something called me, or something with an apparent ego. And so the suggestion from here is a very simple one. It's utterly incomprehensible to the mind, but it's also very simple. The suggestion from here is that the sensation, the experience, whatever we want to call it, that any sensation can have added to it a very particular kind of, we might call it a secondary sensation, that the first sensation was experienced by somebody. The suggestion from here is that that has no more existence than any other sensation. It has no more duration than any other sensation. I mean, perhaps one of the most enduring characteristics of the apparent person, what makes it seem so convincing, is that unlike most sensations, it seems to endure. It seems to endure for longer. I mean, the taste of a cup of tea, that doesn't endure for very long. The sound of a word, the sound of a sentence doesn't endure very long. The sight of a hand waving and pointing, that doesn't endure very long. They're all quite obviously transitory. They're all quite obviously ephemeral, a passing show, as the Buddhists might call them. Right? So the suggestion from here is that any sensation, any feeling, any apprehension, whatever we want to call it, that there is a person for whom those other sensations happen, is also simply a sensation. It has no more significance or importance than the taste of a cup of tea. The sensation, that the impression, the experience, whatever we want to call it, that I am tasting this cup of tea is no more significant than the taste of the cup of tea itself. No less significant, no more significant. But it seems to be longer lasting. It seems to be more pervasive in that sense. It seems to be very convincing because of that. I mean, if you think about it, the evidence that there's a person drinking tea is weaker than the evidence that there is tea. And the evidence that there's tea is fairly strong if you kind of go according to the five senses. The evidence that there's a person drinking tea is much weaker than the evidence that there's tea. And yet, somehow, the sense that I'm drinking this tea, I'm sitting here, I'm listening to this voice. Maybe I'm sitting here wishing I was somewhere else, who knows? Maybe I'm sitting here wishing I was out walking my dog or somebody else's dog. Who knows? For the camera, by the way, that's a reference to a casual conversation that took place before we started filming. I mean, it's so evanescent. The person is so evanescent, and yet it seems so convincing. I mean, it's ever-changing. Again, as the Buddhists point out, I mean, the Buddhists are pretty good on quite a lot of this stuff. It's ever-changing. You can't even say it's one, it's one thing for a second or two, because it is literally ever-changing. There isn't any aspect of the person that is kind of fixed and still and static even for a second. So it is literally always changing. It's not like a second it's fixed and then it changes into something else for another second. It is literally always changing. It's much sort of more slippery than that cup of tea, and yet it's the one thing that seems to persist. A cup of tea might persist 3 minutes or 5 if it's a very hot cup of tea. The sense of being a person might seem to persist for 30, 40, 50, 60, 70, 80 years. It's really bizarre. This sense, there's all this stuff happening. I mean, there is stuff happening in the appearance. There is stuff happening apparently. This slippery word, apparently. Non-duality speakers say there is nothing happening. There is nothing happening. This is nothing happening. This is literally, there is literally nothing, and it happens. Right? And this, right now, is literally nothing happening. So, non-duality speakers, almost by nature, can be extremely slippery. So, when non-duality speaker says there is nothing happening, you have to hear that. I want to say in both ways. You have to hear that in at least 2 ways. There may be other ways you can hear it in as well, but at least 2 ways. There's nothing happening. There is literally nothing happening. This is emptiness. This is emptiness. There's nothing happening, but you have to hear that also. This is nothing happening. This is nothing giving forth whatever seems to be happening. And one of the things that nothing gives forth is the sense that everything else that's happening is happening to a person. And what this voice is saying is that the sense that everything else that happens is happening to a person is also just another thing that's happening, of no more importance, just as evanescent, but in the story of time constantly repeating itself. Constantly repeating itself, far more often than a cup of tea repeats itself. That might be 5 times a day, but constantly, while there is awakeness in the sense of I'm not asleep in the nighttime sense, constantly repeating and reinforcing itself, this sense that everything else that appears to be happening is happening to me, a person. And that's all this is about. All this is about is the possibility of seeing through that. All this is about is the possibility of seeing the collapse of the person. All this is about is a very misleading word. The experience, the possibility of the experience of the person collapsing. Who experiences the person collapsing? No one. Who sees through the person? No one. Who sees the collapse of the person? No one. So what we're talking about here, for the mind, it's a complete mystery. How can it be possible to, for example, see that the person doesn't exist when there's no one to see it? Okay, that seems like a complete mystery. But actually, there's no one who experiences the taste of a cup of tea either. And yet, the taste of a cup of tea can be experienced. It's ridiculous. It's kind of crazy. So the suggestion from here is there is simply whatever's happening. In that sense, every phenomenon is equal. I think I vaguely remember a line in my first book I wrote, a cup of tea and the Trojan War are equal. is equal in that sense. Everything is simply what's arising. Then the apparent person, we'll say more about that perhaps in a little while, the apparent person comes in and makes a judgment about that. He says, no, chosen law is much more important than a cup of tea. Me getting my daily meditation practice is much more important than drinking a cup of tea. Well, yet to the person it may seem like that. To the apparent person it may seem like that. And when the apparent person collapses, when it's seen through, when it's seen, if you like, to be a kind of fraud, the person is kind of fraudulent, and when that's seen, then everything's stopped, because I need to be careful about the next bit. Everything's the same. Everything's the same in a way. In a way is really important. Nothing has any more significance than anything else. In a way. Everything is simply whatever is arising in the story of time, which does not exist, in time, which does not exist, but in the story of time, it's simply what's happening next, what's happening next, what's happening next. And that sneaky little inner way, which I threw in there, and then emphasised, everything is the same in a way. Well, what that inner way is about is that as long as there is a character apparently still alive on the planet, then that character is likely to have preferences. And so, in that sense, for the character, everything is not the same. Everything is the same in that it has the same significance. And the reason for that is because nothing has any significance. So everything's the same in that sense. But for the character, things may matter. The character, there may be preferences. In fact, I'm going to go out on a limb here and say for the character there certainly will be preferences. And you might occasionally come across what I call toxic teachings. Some other people call it poisonous pedagogy. You know, if you listen to certain people who talk about this or talk about Buddhism or talk about spiritual ideas or whatever, suggesting that there is a kind of sort of magical state in which we, the character, whatever you want to call it, rise above all likings and dislikings, all preferences or whatever. So, you know, drinking our favourite cup of coffee or being kicked sharply in the shin by a, whatever, they're the same. And if we experience them as different, then we haven't yet risen into a high enough spiritual plane or whatever. Away with that crap. As long as there's a character, that character will have preferences. They may pretend they don't, but they will have preferences. But so what? That preference again is just something that's naturally arising. Naturally arising. So all we're here to talk about really is just the possibility of that collapse. If you like, the possibility of seeing through the illusion of separation. The illusion of separation, which is another way of saying the illusion of duality. Here to talk about non-duality, not two-ness. We're here to talk about the possibility of seeing through the illusion of duality or two-ness, which is created very simply by the split in experience that happens in quite a young age into there's a world and there is a me existent in the world that's separate from it. That's duality. That's what the two-ness of duality is referring to. The illusion, if you like, the mistake, but the inevitable mistake that almost 100% of us make, not quite 100%, but almost 100% of us make, that there is this two-ness created by, there's a me and there's an external world. This me moves through that external world, and in that external world, this me meets lots of other me's. So that's duality. The mind might very quickly and easily say, well, why duality? There's lots of things, there's far more than two things, so why duality? Why only two? Well, that's the two. That's the split that occurs. The baby, I was blessed with a new grandchild just before Christmas, and at the moment, at the age of, I don't know, what is it, about 3 weeks, I take a good punt that that grandchild is not living in duality, because the sense of separation hasn't occurred yet. So there's, for my grandchild, there is just whatever's happening. And then there comes an age when whatever's happening is happening to me and for me, and that's duality. That's the start of duality. That's the start of the twos. There's everything else, and millions of everything else is. 8 billion apparent people on the planet or whatever. That's one part of duality, and the other part of duality is the sensation that all of that stuff is out there and it's happening for me. I'm in here, that stuff's out there and it's happening for me. So we're talking simply about the possibility of that collapsing, the recognition that the feeling, the sensation, the apprehension, the experience, whatever we want to call it, no word will do. That there's a me in here experiencing everything else out there. Well, it's sometimes been called the divine illusion. It's a mistake, if you like. It's an inevitable mistake. It's an error, but it's an inevitable error. It's an error, it's a mistake, there's nothing wrong with it because it's just inevitably happens. So that sense that I am moving through an external world full of other people who are moving through an external world as well can just collapse. And then there may be the recognition I've stopped because there's nothing. What can you say? The recognition of non-duality. What the hell does that mean? The recognition that there is still simply emptiness, and silence, and stillness, and there is also movement, and there is noise, and there is fullness, which arises out of this emptiness, which is an incredibly tricky thing to say, because that suggests that it's back in duality, it's didn't know. It arises out of it, it is the same as it. In other words, part of the shock of seeing this is not just that I don't exist as a separate being, but it's also like the collapse of all opposites. Silence, noise, opposites are the same. Apparent opposites are the same. Stillness and movement, apparent opposites are the same. And after that seeing what? Well, whatever happens, there's quite likely to be a kind of radical reorientation and re-evaluation of what before that had seemed to be my life. Well, it might not be, but it's quite likely to be. When it's seen that there's no one who's been living this life. If this character has a story about the choices that I've made in this past called my life, good choices and bad choices, choices that have been brought me to the catastrophic state I'm in now, or the magnificent state I'm in now, or whatever it might be, those stories tend to collapse. So if this has been a fairly normal, average kind of character, going through life with a belief in things like free will, and choice. I'm able to create a life for myself which may go well or badly, and that's likely all just simply to collapse, be consigned to the rubbish tip. If this character had a set of beliefs about how the universe is constructed, which is quite likely, so this character had a strong religious belief maybe, or strong spiritual beliefs, or a strong belief in scientific materialism, or whatever it might be. It's very, very strong political beliefs. My life is about justice, social justice. All of that again is likely to collapse. Just be seen as, what can we call it? Empty. Empty. An entertainment for the monkey mind. 40 years of devoted Christianity, or whatever, saving souls for Jesus, just collapsed. 40 years of dedicated meditation to reach the 17th level of sublime bliss, just collapsed. This may be what we're talking about. Maybe, it doesn't have to be, but it may be the most disturbing thing that could possibly, I want to say, happen and not happen, both at the same time. Because this doesn't happen, I'm going to go for not happen, so kind of understand what's being said here. This is the most disturbing thing that could possibly not happen for an apparent person. Doesn't have to be, but it might be. It might turn the apparent person's world totally upside down. It might destroy their most intimate relationships. They might be asked to leave their Buddhist group shortly after this seeing has happened. Or none of that at all. Or the person goes to sleep one evening and the non-person gets up the next day and simply goes to work as usual, and almost no change. Because this isn't about change, but it can bring about, what we're talking about here is transformation. It's actually even beyond transformation. I relate the word transformation to kind of spiritual development and things like that, and this is nothing to do with that. This is not a spiritual message. This is a mystical message, it's not a spiritual message. So the person can be seen through, duality can be seen through, and no effect whatsoever on the life of the character who continues to live that life in less physical death has occurred at the same time. Maybe no effect whatsoever, or an apparently catastrophic effect. I think that wonderful quote, "This can ruin your life," came from Tony originally. I think it's Tony I first heard it from. And boy, oh boy, is that true. This can ruin your life. Or not, because there's absolutely no rules whatsoever. I've certainly met people where this has ruined their life. And I've met people where it's had virtually no disturbing effect whatsoever. And anyway, what the hell, who cares, doesn't matter, because what happens is what happens. If this ruins your life, it ruins your life. If it doesn't, it doesn't. But we're talking about the destruction, if you like, when this is seen, of free will. Not because free will is destroyed, but because the whole sense that there's anybody who could have free will is destroyed. So free will simply becomes irrelevant. No point in having a conversation about whether there's free will or not. And there's nobody who can have free will. Maybe there's some kind of free-floating free will that alights occasionally on a tomcat somewhere or something like that. But there is no person, so free will gone. The past seen through. Time gone, time seen through. Time seen as in illusion. In other words, time seen as something which is different to how it appears. Purpose. Purpose, sense of purpose, gone. There can't be a sense of purpose when there is no one. Well, I suppose there can be a free-floating sense of purpose. Maybe I can't make sense of that. Sense of purpose, no one has a sense of purpose. Morality, gone. No wonder people can get so angry about this stuff. No wonder this is not a good topic to raise in a pub unless you've been taking quite extensive training in karate. You want to start a rumble on a Saturday night? Don't insult somebody's girlfriend in a pub, just try and start a conversation about non-duality. Anyway, that's quite long enough. Oh, look at the time, that's quite long enough for introductory talk. In the appearance of time. Look at the time, in the appearance of time.